The silence of Opana Point was not the absence of sound. It was the absence of threat. It was a Sunday silence, thick with the humidity of the Hawaiian dawn and the rhythmic lullaby hiss of the Pacific Ocean crashing against the volcanic cliffs, 500 feet below. Private First Class Joseph Joe Lockard sat inside the mobile radar truck, a cramped metal box that smelled of stale coffee, ozone, and the warm bakelite scent of the -270 Seychelles rupees radar set. It was December 7, 1941. The time was 6:45. Joe's normal was a green line. For months, his war, the preparation for it, had been defined by the oscilloscope screen in front of him. He was a practitioner of a new, barely understood magic. Radar was a secret, a rumor, a finicky collection of vacuum tubes and copper wires that could see through clouds and darkness. But mostly, it was a machine for generating boredom. His normal was the tedious routine of the 4 a.m. to 7 a.m. watch, scanning the empty ocean, fighting the urge to sleep, and swatting at the mosquitoes that managed to find the only gap in the screen door. Beside him, Private George Elliott was leaning against the bulkhead, practicing his plotting. George was new, eager, and still believed that the Army was an adventure. Joe knew better. The Army was waiting. It was waiting for breakfast trucks that were late, for leave passes that were denied, and for an enemy that the intelligence officers insisted was thousands of miles away, threatening the Philippines or Singapore. Hawaii was a fortress, a paradise, a sleeping giant safe behind 2,000 miles of ocean. "Check the gain again, George," Joe murmured, rubbing his eyes. "You're getting sea return clutter at 20 miles. It's clear, Joe. The scope is clean. Just the milk run flight from the mainland due in later. The machinery of survival, the early warning system that was supposed to protect the Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor was operating on a peacetime schedule. The radar station was scheduled to shut down at 7 o'clock. The truck would be turned off, the generator killed, and the two privates would catch the breakfast truck back to the barracks. The normal was a strict adherence to the clock, not the tactical situation. At 6:58, Joe stretched, his joints popping. "All right, kill it. Watch is over. Let's get some chow." The truck engine idled outside. The sun was rising, painting the horizon in soft pastels of pink and gold. It was going to be a beautiful day. Golf clubs were being polished at the officers' clubs. Church bells were being readied in Honolulu, but George didn't kill the power. He was staring at the scope. "Joe," George whispered, "look at this." Joe leaned back in. On the green screen, a blip had appeared. It wasn't a normal blip. A normal blip, single plane or a small patrol, was a flickering, ghostly pulse. This was a solid, glowing spike. It was growing, it was throbbing. "It's a glitch," Joe said, reaching for the calibration knob. "The equipment is overheating. We've been running hot all morning. It's not a glitch. Look at the range. 136 miles, bearing north-northeast." Joe adjusted the controls. The spike didn't disappear. It resolved. It wasn't one blip. It was a massive, coherent distortion that swallowed a huge sector of the scope. That's bigger than anything I've ever seen," Joe said, the boredom evaporating instantly. "That looks like 50 planes. Maybe more. Maybe the Navy is running a drill." George suggested, his voice hopeful. "The carriers are out. On a Sunday. At 7 o'clock, the Navy doesn't drill on Sunday mornings. They sleep." The precise factual disturbance sat glowing on the screen. It was a technological anomaly that shouldn't exist. A formation of aircraft large enough to blot out the radar return, approaching from a direction where there was nothing but open ocean for thousands of miles. The clock ticked past 7 o'clock. The watch was officially over. They were off duty. They could have turned the switch, walked away, and blamed the machine. But the instability of human judgment, curiosity, unease, The nagging feeling that the green line was lying kept them in the truck. "Call it in," Joe said. "Call the information center at Fort Shafter." George grabbed the field phone. He cranked the handle. The line hissed. "Fort Shafter, this is Opana. We have a target. Large formation. Range 132 miles. Closing fast." The voice. On the other end was a switchboard operator, confused and tired. The information center was also on skeleton crew. The plotters had gone to breakfast. The only officer left was a young lieutenant named Kermit Tyler, a pilot on his second day. Of orientation duty, Joe took the phone. "Sir, this is Private Lockard. The scope is lit up. It looks like, well, it looks like an invasion force, sir, or a massive flight of bombers." There was a silence on the line. Joe could imagine the lieutenant standing in the quiet plotting room, coffee in hand, looking at the empty map tables. The war was in Europe. The war was in China. It wasn't in Hawaii. Then came the order rescinded to Lator, rather, the warning dismissed. "Don't worry about it," Lieutenant Tyler said. "Sir, it's the B-17s," Tyler explained, his voice calm, rational, and fatally wrong. "A flight of B-17 bombers is due in from the mainland this morning. They're tuning their navigation beacons." "That's what you're seeing? Just a delivery run." "Sir, the size of the blip, ... It's huge. It's the B-17s, Private. Don't worry about it." Close up the station. The line went dead. Joe stared at the phone. The logic held. B-17s were expected. The timing matched. The direction was roughly correct. The fragile version of normal reasserted itself. The officers knew better. The machine was just seeing friendly giants coming home. Joe looked at the scope one last time. The blip was at 90 miles, then 70. "They're coming fast for B-17s, George muttered. "Forget it," Joe said, snapping the power switch. The green line faded to a black dot, then vanished. The hum of the radar died. "Lieutenant says it's fine." "Go." They left the truck. The silence of Opana Point returned. The disturbance had been logged, rationalized, and erased. 40 minutes later, T-17s arrived. But they didn't fly like bombers. They flew like hornets. Joe and George were in the breakfast truck, winding down the mountain road, when they heard the drone. It was a high-pitched, whining buzz, distinct from the throaty roar of American radial engines. They looked out the window toward Pearl Harbor. The sky was filling with dots. Not the silver, lumbering shapes of B-17s. These were white, agile planes, with fixed landing gear. And as they banked into the sun, the light caught the red circles painted on their wings. The rising sun, the realization, hit Joe like a physical blow to the chest. The "don't worry about it" order echoed in his mind, mocking him. The green blip hadn't been a delivery run. It had been the first wave of the Imperial Japanese Navy Commander Fuchida's strike force. 183 aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, Zeros? "Oh my God," George whispered. "Joe, the blip." They watched from the mountain as the peaceful Sunday dissolved. Black smoke began to rise from Ford Island. Then the dull, heavy thuds of torpedoes, hitting the battleship's row. The sound took seconds to reach them, a delayed percussion that felt like the island itself was cracking open. The B-17s were dropping armor-piercing bombs on the USS Arizona. They were strafing the airfields where American planes were parked wingtip to prevent sabotage, making them perfect targets for destruction. Joe felt a nausea that had nothing to do with the winding road. He had held the future in his hands for 30 minutes. He had seen the knife coming before it struck. But the machinery of survival, the chain of command, the interpretation of data, the human need for normalcy had failed. The technology had worked perfectly. The people had malfunctioned. He watched the horizon burning red, Joe thought, looking at the plume of oil smoke rising thousands of feet into the air over the harbor, and thought it was dawn till he realized the sun was still hours away. The sun was up, but the world had gone dark. The chaos was now normal. The sheer scale of the deception, the impossible attack from the north, had shattered the illusion of American invulnerability in less than an hour. The truck driver slammed on the brakes as a Zero screamed over the road, barely 50 feet above them, heading back to the carriers. The pilot turned his head. Joe saw his goggles. He saw the scarf fluttering. The disturbance was no longer a blip. It was a face. Joe sat back in the seat, closing his eyes against the smoke. The war had arrived. Not with a declaration, but with a misunderstood electronic pulse. He knew, with a terrible, crushing certainty, that no matter how long the war lasted, he would never see a normal green line again. Every blip would be a threat. Every silence would be a lie. The quiet morning was over, and the storm would last for 4 years. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the untold moments of history, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell for more stories from the front lines.